Hello again and welcome back. We are officially going to start our quest into cellular respiration. So now you have a good background on what enzymes do. You're going to see how they come in later and how important they are to get things done, especially towards the end of cellular respiration. But now let's talk about our introduction into cellular respiration. Let's define what this is before we get into the nitty-gritty of it and talk about a couple key players that are involved in cellular respiration. So let's start off with Roman numeral 2. We're just going to do cellular respiration introduction. So let's introduce this whole entire concept here. Cellular respiration. Intro. So here we go. First thing we need to talk about cellular respiration. Let's just define what this whole thing is. So cellular respiration. Ooh, I can't talk. Can't spell. Cellular. It's a very interesting thing. It's a catabolic pathway, and we're going to define that in a second too, but what a catabolic pathway is, it's a series of reactions. It's not just one reaction from here to here. It's a series of reactions that break down organic fuel with the help of oxygen, because you need to breathe. So it's taking in oxygen and breaking down organic fuel to create three big products: carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So it's a catabolic pathway. That uses oxygen. And I'm going to put O2 for oxygen. Oxygen and organic fuel. By organic fuel, think of the food you eat, the macromolecules you eat, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, all that stuff. It uses oxygen and organic fuel to produce CO2, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. We talked about ATP a while ago. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. That is our cellular energy. This is the big reason we do this whole thing, and so we can get some energy. In the process, we're breathing in oxygen, we're letting out CO2. Water is there because we're mainly water too, but we need that energy. So let's quickly define what a catabolic pathway is. So a catabolic pathway, or anything catabolic, when you're thinking cat, think of breaking down. I have 2 cats, and if they walk by sometime while I'm teaching here, I'll show them to you because they're sweet, but they do break things every now and then, so that's how I remember catabolic pathway. So catabolic pathway is a series of reactions, many reactions basically put together to break down, in this case, organic fuels, but to break down molecules in order to release energy. So that's the beauty of catabolic pathways, is that they're breaking down these complex molecules and releasing the stored energy inside of them. So a series of reactions that break down complex molecules and release energy. In this case, this catabolic pathway that we're talking about for cellular respiration releases a lot of energy, so it's great. Now when we're talking about cellular respiration, here's the overall reaction. We're going to get to the specific reaction in a second. The overall reaction is organic fuel, which can be anything, really. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, even nucleic acids to a certain degree. Organic fuel plus oxygen is going to yield CO2 plus H2O plus energy, ATP. But when we're studying cellular respiration, this is biochemistry. Whenever you hear anyone saying, I'm a biochemist, or I'm gonna go study biochemistry, this is the beginning of biochemistry. This is where it all starts with cellular respiration. Obviously, there's a lot of chemistry involved. We're going atomic on this. and how it relates to the cell, there's your bio part. So there's your biochemistry happening right there. So let's specify it for how we are going to study it and how it's studied in every textbook in the world. So when we're studying cellular respiration, we actually, for the organic fuel that we're going to study, we're going to use the monomer glucose. Remember how important glucose was for carbohydrates and how all of our carbohydrate polymers had glucose as their monomer? It is so abundant in our diet that it was just the easiest way to classify how does this whole cellular respiration pathway work. So we start with glucose and we just move forward. You can honestly do this with lipids, fatty acid chains, proteins, all of that too. But glucose gives you the greatest breadth of knowledge from the beginning to the very end of how we metabolize food. So when people say you have a really good metabolism or like you're trying to metabolize something, this is the process of metabolism. It's how do you use your food to make energy? That's metabolism. And so sometimes you'll hear people say, instead of cellular respiration, you'll hear cellular metabolism or just metabolism. Same thing, because it's all the same reaction. So let's write this out in regards to glucose. So if you remember what the chemical structure is for glucose, awesome. If not, I got your back. So glucose is C6H12O6. You're going to know it after this if you don't remember it from before. So what you're doing is C6H12O6, so glucose, plus O2 gives out CO2 plus water plus ATP. I have spaces here for a reason. We need to balance this reaction now because it's chemistry. Now we have a starting material and all of that is lovely. ATP doesn't get balanced out because that's something that it's a byproduct that actually gets made in this whole thing, but it's important. So one molecule of glucose is actually going to bind or react with, not bind, but react with 6 molecules of oxygen. And that's going to be very fun. It's going to make 6 CO2 and 6 waters. And in the process of doing this whole entire reaction, you're going to get anywhere from 34 to 38 molecules of ATP. It just depends on how efficient your cells are being at that time. So we could be promising, and we'll say 38. How's that sound? Because the way we describe it, at the end of the day, you're going to get 38 ATPs. What's happening here with this reaction is that this is something called a redox reaction. So number 1 under this whole entire thing, so this would be this whole cellular respiration. The cellular respiration reaction is what we call a redox reaction, and that's short for oxidation and reduction. And what that means is that somebody is losing electrons while somebody is gaining electrons. So cellular respiration reaction is a redox reaction. And RXN is short for reaction. What's happening here is that glucose is getting oxidized into CO2. So glucose is getting oxidized and oxygen is getting reduced. So this is reduced. And here's what that means. And you're like, why is this important? I'll tell you in a minute. What you gotta know is that glucose is oxidized Glucose is oxidized, therefore it is losing electrons. So losing electrons. And now oxygen is reduced. So if one's losing electrons, somebody has to gain it. This guy is gaining electrons. Why is this important? All right, here's why. In glucose, it's actually it's a larger molecule. Compare that to oxygen or CO2 or water. It's pretty large. The cool thing about glucose is it has a ton of hydrogens. Those hydrogens are helpers in this respect. Hydrogen is a lovely little atom, very simple, has one proton and one electron. That's it. No neutrons or anything like that. One proton, one electron, boom, you got hydrogen. And within the hydrogen atom, you have these electrons, obviously. Electrons are where all the reaction is. And so if you're donating electrons or sharing electrons and whatever it is, so bonds are made by sharing electrons, bonds are broken by breaking up electrons. It's all about the electron. So the way we make cellular energy is by literally stripping the electrons from glucose in order to power up the energy we're going to make at the very end. But the thing is, you want to strip these electrons away a little bit at a time, not all at once, because if you do it slowly, you kind of ramp up the electron potential, if you will, and so it's like you're just waiting and waiting and waiting, and then you let them go down this slide and you make a ton of energy at the very end of it. And so we have a mechanism in place to allow us to take the electrons from glucose a little bit at a time and transfer them over time to make more energy. So there's a lot of energy, potential energy, if you will, stored up in glucose. And we're just going to break it away a little bit at a time to make a ton of energy on the other side. So this is our cellular respiration reaction. It is about electrons, so you have to know that. The other thing I want you to know is, I'm going to erase this really quick so I have some room, but I want to keep this up. So, and this will be big B. So glucose is big in cellular respiration, at least for our studies. And the other thing, the other character in this play, if you will, is an electron acceptor. So if we're moving electrons all over the place, we actually need someone to pick up these electrons and take them to the energy production plant. I want you to think of these guys in the play, and this is how I've always taught my students, and it seems to work. So if the electrons are children, and we're going to work with 2 electrons at a time. If you work with, if the electrons are children, you're going to have this molecule act as a parent, okay, a mom or a dad, and this parent, and pretend these are like itty bitty children, like infant toddlers, and they can't do too much on their own, so you're helping them out. So this molecule acts as a parent, scoops up 2 electrons, 2 kids, takes them up the slide in a playground, walks them up the slide on a playground, and takes them to the top of the slide and lets them slide down. And there's somebody safe to pick them up at the very bottom. So that process of picking up your electrons, your kids, taking them up the slide, you're increasing their energy potential, and as they slide down the slide, all of that energy is released in the form of kinetic energy, right? So that's kind of what these molecules are about to do. So let's introduce what these parent molecules are called. So you have an electron acceptor, and we call this one NAD+. So this one is picking up the electrons, and he's about to take them down to the slide. And so as soon as the electrons are released, so as soon as he grabs the electrons, he's actually now going to change its identity, but it's going to be cool. The electron acceptor NAD+, and the electron donor NADH. Okay. Actually, not donor. I'm going to call that carrier. Forgive me. Carrier. Because it literally is carrying. So you have an electron acceptor, NAD+. It picks up the electrons, puts them down the slide, or anything, and the one grabbing them at the bottom, that's going to be NADH. Okay. So here's how it works. So NAD stands for, hang on, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. You do not need to memorize that. That's perfectly fine. You do need to be familiar with NAD+, and that's a positive charge, and NADH. Here's how they work. So little by little, glucose is releasing and getting, there's a lot of reactions going on with glucose, and these electrons are being taken away from glucose. And what happens, and I'm just going to draw glucose, just a chunk of it. There's 6 carbons. I'm just going to linearize it really quickly. So you see just a few. There's more. So there's 6 total. But I'm just going to linearize it really quickly just so you get a taste of it. And remember that it's like OH, and OH, H, H, H. All right, so it just keeps on going. So these hydrogens are chock full of all this energy right here. And each hydrogen, so somewhere, I want you to remember that hydrogen equals 1 proton and 1 electron. That's what hydrogen is. So if you lose an electron on hydrogen, you literally have a proton, right? And so you don't really lose protons in hydrogens, they stay. So if you lose an electron, because that's out in the outer cloud around the nucleus is just made of 1 proton, and you have this 1 electron hanging around it, that 1 electron can easily leave, and you're literally left with a proton. So an H plus is a proton. So remember all this chemistry, it's going to come back. So what happens during the course of this cellular respiration event? It's a whole bunch of reactions, and we're going to get to that. But NAD plus comes into play. So every now and then you're going to see NAD plus enter the game. And what NAD plus does is when it reacts with an organic molecule like this, it is able to take a hydrogen and a half, if you will, away from whatever it's reacting with. So it's going to take 2 hydrogens. So let's say it takes this hydrogen and it takes this hydrogen, right? So if I were to take these 2 hydrogens and kind of show you what they look like atomically. So one of these hydrogens, you got 1 proton, you got 1 electron. This hydrogen, you got 1 proton, 1 electron. All right, what NAD plus does is it's able to take 1 proton and 1 electron, which is a hydrogen, and it also takes another electron. So here's how NAD plus, once it scoops up those 2 electrons in its arms, it becomes NADH. Here's why. So this is going to become NADH. This H is this guy right there. So this is how NAD plus works. It finds a molecule, scoops up 2 hydrogens, and strips them, basically. So it takes 1 whole hydrogen to itself, and then it takes an electron to balance out that positive charge. So now it's neutral. That's why it's NADH. No positive, no negative, it's just neutral. That extra proton that never gets used up gets made as another product. So now you have an extra proton. So here's your proton. And you also have whatever's left over of your organic molecule that you were working with. So that's fine. But that's how NAD plus becomes NADH. This is the electron acceptor. This is the electron carrier. It's carrying 2 electrons are in there. And that's important because at the end of our cellular respiration event, so NAD plus scoops up the electrons, it's now NADH. NADH is going to walk over to the slide and release these electrons down the slide. Releasing those electrons down the slide is going to make all that energy we need. So during the course of all of cellular respiration, you're going to see NAD plus to NADH a lot. In your mind, I want you to remember every time I see NAD plus, there's 2 electrons that guy's holding. And that's important. And that's why it becomes you got NADH, because 1 proton and 1 electron do go by, or go with it, but you also gain another electron to balance out that charge. All right, that's biochemistry. This is why you're in advanced biology. It's stuff like this, the details, it's kind of cool. And it helps you understand the why behind everything that's gonna come sooner or later. I could easily tell you oh, just know that there's NAD plus and NADH and not describe it to you, it helps to understand how in the world did this become that? It's because of this. I hope that's helpful. All right, and now I'm gonna stop the video because when we come back, I promise you, we are gonna start cellular respiration. It's actually gonna start. We're gonna have a quick introduction and like an overall big picture view. We're gonna bring in the mitochondria finally and talk about that guy. And we'll start our reactions that involve all of this to help make that. All right, thank you, I'll see you soon.